So our next speaker is Rachel Bolton. I met Rachel only recently through Celine, but we bonded quickly and could have talked for hours, it felt like. She is indeed a map lover and is especially interested in panoramic maps. She is a lecturer in American Studies at Stanford, has an AB degree in English from Princeton, a master's from the University of Cambridge, a PhD in English from Stanford. She specializes in 19th and 20th century American culture. Her research and teaching interests include California and the West, the history of science and technology, photography, material culture, and environmental humanities. Her current book projects explores a long history of literary and visual description. Rachel, thank you.
This is my mic. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. As Tom mentioned, I did my graduate work here at Stanford, so I've been coming to events at the Rumsey Center over the years. I love this collection. I'm really delighted to be a part of this conference today. I'm looking forward to the rest of the program. So thank you so much for having me. So as Tom mentioned, this is part of a larger project. And this section is about the lives and the afterlives of the panorama in California from the 19th century. It's sort of its biggest moment through to the Great Depression. And so I'm going to start with a brief overview of what this project thinks through, and then share some material directly from the project itself. So I wanted to open, as this section of the project does, with the 1878 Muybridge Panorama of San Francisco. This is actually the copy that's here at Stanford in special collections. It's about it's 13 panels. Whoops, I'm not going. There we go. And each of the panels is 27 inches by 17 inches. And actually, usually when I share this, I don't have the benefit of a screen this size. And so I have to sort of articulate how big it is. But this is actually bigger than life size. But the panorama itself, and here's the dedication to Jane Stanford. The panorama itself is actually too big to unfold on a table in special collections simultaneously. Again, this is probably a little bit closer to scale than I usually get projecting this in the classroom. But I wanted to share this because this is the best known example of a form that's used almost compulsively in the 19th century to describe California, both in photographs, but also things like painted panoramas, moving panoramas, panoramic maps. Rebecca Solnit talks about how it's a way of seeing in time. It also gives us a sense of scale in a really sort of easy to perceive way. And in my project, I pay special attention to its entangling with disaster. And this is really clear in the archive of the 1906 earthquake and fire. Again, this is an image from Stanford Special Collections. This was a supplement to the San Francisco Examiner from July 29th, 1906, that shows the fashionable shopping and retail districts as the camera sees them. It was a sort of full supplement. You can see other images like this in Stanford collections. There are other objects like this is an example of one of George Lawrence's panoramas that he made with a series of coin kites suspended above the bay, some for the USGS. I think there's one in the Rumsey Center collection as well. They're really sort of fascinating objects and just a way of making sense of the sort of totalizing effect of the disaster on the landscape. I follow the trajectory of the form of the panorama from form to metaphor. This isn't a linear evolution. As I mentioned, it's a really popular form in the late 19th century. And, at a certain point, it starts to be used more and more often as a kind of metaphor in literary forms, but it does persist in this sort of more visual space as well. And so, I'm not going to talk about this today, but I'd be happy to answer questions about this. But I'm also interested in the ways that it shows up in literary texts too. I look at the novel McTeague, but more especially, I find echoes of the panorama in materials made in the Great Depression. So thinking of the American Guide series produced by the Federal Writers Project, which some of you might be familiar with, a really wonderful way to sort of navigate around the country even today. You can find them at used bookstores anywhere. But then also a cluster of novels too, like Ask the Dust, Day of the Locust, and Mildred Pierce, which some of you might be familiar with. But anyway, like I said, I wanted to turn to a piece of the project itself. And this is, primarily using materials here at the Rumsey Map Center and also at the Huntington Library. So that's just sort of letting you know where all of these images are going to be coming from. So, this is also just to share another example. This is a spread taken from one of the Depression era federal guides to California. So there you are at the Golden Gate International Exposition on Treasure Island. You have dressed for the day, a new dark suit, your coat belted and buttoned to the collar against the foggy San Francisco day, hat pinned to your hair at an angle. Even in heels, you're smaller than the other women, so you find a place at the front of the group, just to the right of Zoe Del Lantis Nutter in her pirate costume, your smile and overbite, eager, your weight on your right foot, your left above the marina. You could walk out onto the city. You ask a question. Work on the WPA scale model of San Francisco started in late 1938 and continued for 2 years. 1,200 man-months of labor for 300 field investigators, modelers, craftsmen, and engineers. In government photographs, these men and women are absorbed, intent, bent over the little buildings and blocks with all the delicacy that making something so small requires. This was a make work project that when complete would have, quote, tourist as well as educational value, its directors wrote in 1940. And this is quoting again, by studying it, visitors who are unacquainted with San Francisco and school children may secure a comprehensive picture of our streets and main highways, our residential, industrial, and business districts, our historical landmarks, parks, and playgrounds. Mostly it was meant for making studies for a master plan for the physical development of the city in all its phases, as it was when city planners used the model to plan a subway down Market Street, later BART and municipal bus lines. The model is 42 by 38 feet with 138 pieces of 6,000 city blocks that fit together like a puzzle. Its trees and shrubs are made from wire wool and sponge and beet seeds, little buildings, painted wood, the more detailed pieces of carving, poplar or sugar pine. Looking at the model today, you can see in detail parts of the city that have since disappeared or were not yet built in the late 1930s. The Fox Theater and Adolf Sutro estates gone, the Glen Park neighborhood and the south part of the city only a lattice of streets in 1938. But the model also registers smaller losses. The model was restored as part of a collaboration between SF MoMA and the San Francisco Public Library, photographed by Beth LaBerge, and made into a composite image by David Rumsey. During the restoration, it was discovered 178 blocks were missing, among them City Hall, Seals Stadium, the Golden Gate Bridge, and part of the Bay Bridge. The rest may be more personal thefts, a childhood home, a favorite bar. The blocks are pastel and sweet. Hold one in your hand and want to keep it. I should tell you now that the photograph of the model at the Golden Gate International Exposition might be fake. The model does not appear in fair materials, in guidebooks or other accounts, and the photograph is stamped for Valentine's Day, 1939, 4 days before the grand opening and a year before the model was complete. Looking closely, you can see how the women could have been cut and pasted here, legs cut at the ankle, their hatted outlines sharp. There are no shadows. In the archive, you can find many photographs of the model on display in San Francisco City Hall, but no others at the fair. There are also reasons for thinking the photograph is real, for thinking the photograph belongs at the Golden Gate International Exposition. A World's Fair place with scale, its hyperbole, its national pavilions, countries in summary. On the other hand, all the miniatures and attractions, the city within a city, surrounded by baffles to keep out the wind, the air inside still as a diorama. The Golden Gate International Exposition has a kind of funhouse feel in its extremes of size. Maybe this has something to do with Treasure Island being built for the fair. It's making a kind of model building dredged out of the San Francisco Bay by the Army Corps of Engineers to be turned into an airport and administration building after 1940. So much of the fair would make you feel small. The 200-foot murals of state and national, natural and industrial histories, or the massive white pavilions, windowless and sepulchral. From a guidebook advertisement for Barrett and Hilp, the contractor that built many of the exhibit halls, the Golden Gate Bridge and the eastern span of the Transbay Bridge, I'm quoting here, masters of immensity. As you gaze upon the magnificent giant statue of Pacifica overlooking the Court of the Seven Seas, you are admiring just one of the dozens of big jobs constructed what is probably the largest building organization in the West. Or you could visit the Owl Drug Store at 10,000 square feet, reads the guidebook, quote, one of the largest drug outlets in the United States. 60 people are employed, 15,000 items are on display. Front of the building is decorated with pillars topped by sculptured owls. Fountain seating is 94 at rear, indirect lighting throughout. A glass display counter 20 feet high is at the center of the store. So a very thrilling attraction. Scale takes stranger forms. 1,000-pound fruitcake baked from, quote, California products only, hundreds of pounds of dry as ingredients, 50 dozen eggs, 10 gallons of wine, which took Bill Baker of Ojai 1 year to make. Or the official key of the Golden Gate International Exposition, the, quote, largest, most spectacular object of its kind fashioned in modern times, which the governor used to open the fair, made from 18 ounces of native California gold, set with diamonds, tourmalines, 30 fancy cut pink tourmalines, and 8 choice specimens of benitoite, the rarest stone in the world. Only one vein of benitoite has ever been discovered in San Benito County, California. At the entrance to the fair, the National Cash Register counted visitors. Would you like to know exactly how many persons are on the fairgrounds today, or the number who have attended the fair to date? This is quoting from the guidebook again. Both of these are recorded every half hour on a giant model of a cash register at the corner of Avenue of Olives and Paso Flora Way. The figures are 2 feet 4 inches high. In the base of the model cash register are window displays showing cash register equipment. In one photograph, a woman in a white coat walks toward the machine. Attendance today, 30,979. Does the woman count? Susan Stewart writes in On Longing that, quote, the microcosmic aspects of the almanac make it particularly suited for miniaturization. A fair is like this too. 30 miniature rooms made by Narcissa Nyblack Thorne, quote, worth $500,000 in skill and materials, the guidebook says, and perfect in every detail, were on display in the Palace of Fine and Decorative Arts. A series of abstract and miniature realistic dioramas by John Haley and John Townsley in the Pacific Basin building, quote, tell the story of the discovery of the Pacific and demonstrate the way in which modern methods of communication have unified the area. In Vacation Land, quote, a scale model of the most recent type locomotive is placed atop the Santa Fe Railroad exhibit, which includes a model train in operation. And in the International Hall, you could see 3,000 silver spoons and an acorn, 30 elephants and a seed, and a 4-inch rifle among the 200,000 miniature hand-carved items collected by Jules Charbonneau of Seattle. There was a miniature streamline railway that ran over more than 2,000 feet of track. The guidebook calls this the most complete miniature railroad in existence. Its descriptive paradoxes celebrating, as Stewart writes, the distinction between scale and might, materiality and meaning. In the Gayway, you could ride the speed cars, miniature British automobiles, you operate them, and watch a cartoon at the Lux, a modern miniature movie theater, or visit Midget City, a complete Lilliputian village. In a trip to the San Francisco Exposition, Golden Gate International Exposition with Bobby and Betty, we see the fair from the perspective of 2 children. Joseph Henry Jackson, editor of Sunset Magazine, tries to capture its bigness and its smallness both, its difficulty to describe. Instead of an aerial photograph of the fair itself, the book opens with a photograph of a model. This is quoting from the book. When they built the exposition, they made this model first. Now pictures of it give Bobby and Betty their best idea of just how the whole of treasure is laid out. Somehow this photograph, uncanny removed, is easier to understand. Little ferries come into port or head back to the city. A little seaplane lands on the bay, its tail reflected in the plastic surface of the water. Driving over the Bay Bridge, quote, neither Bobby nor Betty would have believed that just driving onto Treasure Island could have made everything seem so different. Later, they think it might be restful to try going down into a model mine just for a change. Dad told them all he knew about the man-made mountain in the Hall of Mines, but even then, they weren't prepared for the hugeness of it. Bobby and Betty and their parents feel awed, amazed, out of place. On their second day, the family takes a ferry to the fair. Bobby and Betty feed the seagulls and, quote, as their bright orange ferry swung out into the bay, they discovered that the breeze had already cleared the water of mist. And though they couldn't quite see the top of the Bay Bridge, the Tower of the Sun on Treasure Island stood out sharp and clear in the sunlight. Their ferry hooted once, not a mournful note like the boat they had heard the evening before, but a cheerful whistle that seemed to say, here we come, Treasure Island. In the official guidebook, the ferry is listed as the first way to get to the Golden Gate International Exposition. Tickets cost 5 or 7 cents, and boats to Treasure Island run by the Key system left every 10 minutes, more often during fair hours. The last boat back to the city at 2:25 in the morning to the ferry building on the Embarcadero. Walking through the ferry building to the dock, you would have seen the 600-foot scale map of the state of California made by J.T. Edwards and installed there in 1924. The map was the largest of its kind and cost more than $100,000 to make, funded mostly by boosters. Edwards was well known for his models. Often he worked with developers on models of planned cities and the Forest Hill Cemetery in Los Angeles, and for the Union Pacific Railroad, making window installations for the railroad showing popular destinations like Yellowstone, Bryce, and Zion, or the comforts of train travel. He had showed his work, and here it is, a map of New York City and San Francisco before at the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. The opening of the 1924 scale map of California was celebrated with a luncheon at the Fairmont Hotel, a ceremonial unveiling in the afternoon, and a state dinner at the Palace Hotel, all, quote, preliminary to Greater California Day to be observed Thursday, when messages declaring the unification of all public-spirited clubs, the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, would be broadcast across the state. Miss Ann Porter of 2164 Hyde Street, San Francisco, won a public contest to name the model called California Paradise in Panorama. Edwards, and here he is, and his family made many photographs of his work, some collected into albums. In one, his young son, Gene, plays quietly, dressed in white stockings and a shirt ruffled at the chest and wrists, a long velvet coat, buckled loafers, and a black three-cornered hat trimmed with lace. In his right hand, he holds a bouquet of strings tied to 18 toy ships sailing into the Pacific from Arcata Bay. Gene sits in the mountains of Northern California, his feet resting just above Eureka, his gaze somewhere far away. In photographs in the albums, Gene and the other Edwards children appear in costume many times, often to promote some new development. As frontier women and soldiers at painted pinnacles, or Gene dressed as the little blue boy in a parade at the Gainsborough Estates near Pasadena. In these photographs, it is hard to guess if they are having fun. Maybe this is because the models Edwards makes are not for play or not exactly, both inviting and remote. You can stand at a distance and look. The Saturday Evening Post described what it felt like to see the scale map of California. That's where I live, is the pleased involuntary remark of the passerby. There are even individual ranch homes that shows up. Charts and maps are for various users, the navigator, the air pilot, the motorist, the city engineer, the camper and hunter, even the law enforcement officer. But why should not every state, city, and village have a map placed where all may see and which even the youngest can understand for merely educational purposes? In gazing upon such a modeled replica of a town or city or state, the resident would naturally look first for his own location. We all do that. But he might learn incidentally to look too for other fellows' homes, to see why he lives there and what he has there. We always think more of the adjoining hamlet after we have visited it. If every time we go shopping on Main Street, we see the nearby town of Jonesville on the map, it won't seem like such a foreign country, and that is half of education. This article, which Edwards or one of his family pasted in the front cover of an album, was published on February 14th, 1925, exactly 14 years before this photograph of the scale model of San Francisco at the Golden Gate International Exposition was made, or at least its timestamp suggests. What is Zoe Dullantis Nutter pointing to? Maybe like the pleased passerby of the Saturday Evening Post, or the readers and reviewers of the American Guides, or the people of San Francisco in 2019, who after its restoration could visit segments of the WPA model in local branches of their public library. She is showing someone their home. But there is something darker here in the way we need to learn to look for something other than ourselves in small attractions. Critic C.N. Nye has described the powerlessness and cruelty that attend our encounters with the cute, feelings that could account for the theft of so many blocks from the WPA model, or the disappearance of the Edwards map, seemingly too big to be lost, but last seen in crates in a waterfront warehouse in 2010. The women in the photograph, one of their faces crossed out with black pen, marked for some purpose, loom over the little city like monsters. That's where you live, you, the destroyer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We have a question from Nick Canis. in the chat. Nick says, we have an early 20th century photographic panorama of San Francisco as seen from the Embarcadero. One of the advertising signs on the building has the item name spelled backwards, like you see on the front of an ambulance. Have you seen this name reversal in other old panorama images? It doesn't seem to be a feature of the photograph since the other panels are depicted correctly, but perhaps it was an intentional attention-seeking device by the advertiser.
I haven't seen this. This is totally fascinating though, and I would love to see the panorama. The one thing that I would say about this that it's bringing to mind for me is, and this is something that Rebecca Solnit talks about with the Muybridge Panorama, is the kind of glitches that show up in a lot of these photographs because they had to be made in this sort of piecemeal way. And Muybridge made this photograph over the course of almost an entire day. And as you look at it, you can see the sort of time change in that you can sort of observe that in a couple of different ways, probably most notably the ways the shadows change from panel to panel, but also some of the streets, in certain panels are more crowded and others, it's early in the morning, there aren't many people out yet. But there is one panel, and unfortunately I'm forgetting which one it is, but maybe somebody especially eagle-eyed can spot it, that actually is out of order because he sort of made a different exposure. But yeah, I mean, they present an interesting problem because they do sort of affect this kind of seamlessness, but at the same time, you can observe these, like I said, sort of glitches in them that make us really think a lot about how they've been put together. But yeah, thank you for that question.
You mentioned the panoramic form showing up in literature. What examples of literature could you give us to explain that a little further?
Sure. Probably the most concrete example would be in the novel McTeague, which is set in turn of the century San Francisco. One of the sort of opening passages, the narrator says, day after day, McTeague saw the same panorama unroll itself, and goes on to sort of describe what I think it's Polk Street looks like every day from the window of his dentist's office. And what Frank Norris is sort of invoking with that metaphor is maybe photographic panoramas, but certainly the painted panorama, which were often advertised in really hyperbolic ways as being sort of these miles-long canvases that would enroll between two spools with hours of narration. Sometimes there were special effects like fog and music and different lighting cues, things like that, as sort of proto-cinematic form. And so that's probably the most concrete example. But one of the things that I look at in some of the novels from the 1930s is the way that they do this kind of, and maybe this is sort of invoking more of the proto-cinematic aspects of the form, but do a kind of tracking shot. Especially like Mildred Pierce, there's a sequence where the main character is driving through a storm and it becomes this really sort of details become, they attain like a certain kind of significance, almost if you're sort of looking out the window and seeing it pass before you. And it also has this really interesting geographic specificity. The route that Mildred takes in the novel that James Cain describes, you can follow it on Google Maps. It's totally checks out as like a way of navigating through the city. So it's doing this sort of simultaneously spatial, but also a sort of visual entertainment kind of thing too.
Thank you. Got a couple more questions here. Sure.
Yeah, you offered us a very beautiful visual linguistic expression. Thank you. And I was reminded of the first chapter of John Fowles' Daniel Martin. I just wondered, what forms of literature do you read?
That's a very generous question. Thank you. I haven't read that novel. I've read other John Fowles novels. Terrible. Okay, I'll check out the first chapter. I did my graduate work in English, but a lot of the things that I read and am attracted to as a reader and a writer are sort of not necessarily literary forms. As I mentioned, I really have this longstanding fascination with the WPA guides, different kinds of writing that try on a kind of more experimental way of describing something. In that case, it's sort of a collective form of writing, and one that also is, precipitating a reader who's going to go navigate that space, whether from their, armchair or actually behind the wheel of a car. But I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of contemporary essayists who I really like. I cited Rebecca Solnit's work, but also, there's a lot of other people, Lawrence Wexler, who I really enjoy a lot. But yeah, also welcome to any recommendations too. So.
Thank you. I think Bill Sawyers has a question here.
Thanks. So I think of the WPA as a creature of the Depression. But by the time of the fair, it would seem to me that for people to invest in that and put that on, these would people would have a lot of confidence and optimism. And so, can you talk a little bit about the view of the world, the view of the economy, around the time of the fair and before that, and how that had changed recently?
Sure. So there's a couple of things that I can share with you. One is I mentioned that the extant photographs of the model are on display at City Hall. And the reason that this model, is it's up and then it gets taken down pretty rapidly because, of course, the United States enters World War II, and it didn't seem advisable to have a really detailed model of San Francisco publicly available. But sort of thinking about the fair itself, I don't know. It's an interesting question because I think I agree. You're totally right. There's ways that the 1939 fair, similar to the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition, which was sort of this San Francisco has recovered from the 1906 earthquake. They often have this sort of rhetoric of sort of rejuvenation, a sort of future optimism. There are a lot of exhibitions at the fair itself that are specifically about WPA projects. So I, had to cut some of the miniatures that I included in this section because there are just so many. But one of the others that's really fascinating to me is that they included not quite so small, but sort of mid-size miniature models of WPA housing projects. And I'm trying to think what else would have been there. I mean, on the one hand, it's sort of invoking the work of the WPA as something that is, propelling the American public out of the Depression. But on the other, there's sort of these things that take a much longer view. I shared Diego Rivera's mural, but then there's also, and you can see video footage of this on the Internet Archive. There was a live show, and I'm forgetting the name of it, that was sort of a historical panorama pageant of California that starts before settler contact and then works its way up to the present. And that kind of spectacle certainly has this sort of very forward-looking March of History kind of affect. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess my answer to your question is that it's sort of both and in terms of thinking about the fair as a space for showcasing the recovery work of the WPA and different federal projects, and then also sort of projecting into a much more optimistic future.
That Diego Rivera mural is up at the Museum of Modern Art for a short time, a limited time, I should say. So I highly recommend that you guys go up there and check it out. It's amazing.
I had two things. One, can you describe for us a little bit the machine in the center and what we're looking at there? And then also, I am curious to hear about your journey, which seems to have followed both the literary path and the visual path, and you're pursuing both of those things. I'm curious to know about the inspiration for that.
Sure. To my honest answer is I'm not sure what's going on with this machine, and I'd be interested to hear what any of you all think is happening here. The one thing that it does evoke for me is something from actually the New York Fair, and one of the Westinghouse exhibitions at the sort of contemporary 1939 fair in New York was this robot named Electro who could smoke cigarettes. That was like a big attraction there. And so I don't know, I guess maybe I'm reading this in this sort of cyborg quality of this robot that has, on the one side an arm and a sort of human face in the middle, but then also like very sort of Art Deco structure. So yeah, I don't know. There's also something very sinister to me about it, even though it is part of this narrative. I mean, Diego Rivera has his own political beliefs that, I'm sure are coming to bear here. I guess what I would say about your other question about the literary and the visual, Tom, you mentioned that my project is about description. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is sort of navigating between how a literary work imagines description and how we encounter that as readers, but then also the way that as a writer, thinking about visual materials requires me to do a different kind of description. And so navigating between the sort of space of somebody who receives description and tries to make sense of it, and then is sort of in other ways visual material asked to do some of that descriptive work myself, and how that does its own kind of interpretive work.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, Rachel, thank you so much. We have a small token of our appreciation to give to you. Thank you again so much.
Thank you for having me.